As a result of the European arrival in the New World and their fervor for more converts and for resources like gold, land, and of course a name for themselves, there were other things that also happened. I kind of mentioned how the Aztecs had been impacted by some of the diseases that they encountered when Cortés came around. Okay, hold that thought. The fervor to incorporate natives into Spanish society, Hispanic society, if you will, became very, very, very brutal in various different ways. The expectation that Native Americans would assimilate into Spanish culture was very high and oftentimes would lead to various different brutality. There wasn't quite the wholesale slavery that would exist in other parts of the Americas that would come later, but it was still very brutal, and oftentimes you would have an indenture type situation um, that would lead to that. So you have brutal indentured labor, you have an expectation of assimilation, you have intermarriages between Spanish Europeans and natives that creates a mestizo culture in society. But the biggest things that actually come about with the European introduction to the Americas goes along with what's exchanged, because the Spaniards and other Europeans are taking stuff from the New World and they're bringing it back to Europe. Okay? So there are pros and cons in what we will call the Columbian exchange. Okay? The Columbian exchange is the biological, cultural, and economic exchange of goods and other things between the New World and Old World Europe that European explorers and the like would bring back and forth. On the pro side, you can guess pretty much who benefited the most from the Columbian exchange. And if you guessed it was Europeans, you're right. Okay? Europe was starving at this time. They were overpopulated. They struggled to feed themselves. Okay? There was a lack of opportunity. So, you're a European explorer and now you've encountered Mesoamericans in the Central Valley of Mexico who have mastered growing crops like corn, beans, and squash, and eventually the potato. All of those were advented and invented in modern day Mexico. And if you think about Mexican food and all the masa that you might eat, whether it's corn tortillas or tamales, or you might have enchiladas, flautas, all kinds of different things are made with corn in Mexican food. That is a staple of Mexican food. Well, that stems from their old Aztec days. Okay? Beans, squash, gosh, potatoes. We're going to talk later on this class about European immigration to the eventual United States and how the decade of the 1840s and then eventually the 1850s as well was very large for various different Europeans, of which many of whom were Irish. Well, Ireland and Irish cuisine is largely influenced by the potato. Well, it was Europeans who brought back potatoes from the New World to Europe that would feed Europeans. Ireland has Mexico to thank for half its diet. Okay? So, you have all kinds of foodstuffs that are now being brought from the New World to Europe, and it's feeding starving Europeans. They are now able to feed themselves, and their diets improve, and therefore their health begins to improve, and their lives extend. Great. That's a positive benefit to the cultural exchange that we know as the Columbian exchange. Okay, so from that standpoint, the foodstuffs being brought back to Europe are great. Other things, many Europeans are becoming wealthy in the agricultural trade. some of whom are discovering various different mines and other gold and silver resources. They are being mined and brought back to Spain and other places in Europe. People are getting filthy rich in Europe because of the things that have been discovered in the New World and then brought back and sold in Europe. Okay, so those are some of the things that Europeans are benefiting from. You have Europeans who now have this opportunity to strike it rich. You have others who can now feed themselves. Then there's another aspect of the benefit. Well, as you have empires that are now being built and Spain claiming lands as sovereign and theirs, you might have an opportunity to leave overcrowded Europe. Say, for example, you're a Spaniard and you don't have an opportunity to own more land in northern Spain so you can work your ranch. Well, how about the viceroyalty in Nueva España, modern day Mexico, says, hey, Spaniard, life's tough up in northern Spain. How about you come to Nueva España? We'll give you 80 hectares worth of land, and you can grow crops, or you can use that as ranch land and maintain a head of cattle and horses and sheep and do all kinds of different things. So if you're a European, mostly Spaniards, you can now come to the New World and you can have a new opportunity. Okay. This exchange is largely beneficial for Europeans. Let's talk about the flip side. Okay. The flip side is, well, if you're Amerindian, you just kind of got conquered and you kind of are now going to be put into a laborious type situation. You're going to be forced to learn this new language and this new religion, neither of which you know anything about, but you're going to have to know stuff about it. You're going to be indentured. You're going to have to go into hard labor often at times. Yikes. I don't know about this. That's not good. Your resources are going to be taken from you. You might even actually have to mine your resources or otherwise work your resources, kind of add insult to injury. The worst of it, though, is that Europeans are going to bring from Europe not just their fervor for new converts or gold or glory or anything else like that. They're going to bring diseases. And I've mentioned earlier, you're not going to have immunity to the various different diseases that they're going to bring, like smallpox, for example. And if you encounter a disease of which you have no immunity, it could perhaps be very deadly. And eventually, it's estimated that 90% of native populations in the Americas would succumb to European diseases. Now, many historians agree and disagree on the exact percentage, but what we can tell you factually is that is a massive, massive impact on Native Americans. Not necessarily all at once, but eventually over the course of decades and even centuries. It decimated native populations. Resources were stripped, lands conquered, people conquered. Okay? Overall, though, from a world perspective, New World crops from the Americas fed starving Europeans. Okay? It had the unfortunate consequence of also killing off a massive percentage of Native Americans. Okay? So you got to understand the good with the bad when it comes to the Columbian Exchange. It's always good when people have opportunity to feed themselves and to eat and maintain their health. And it's also really, really disheartening when people had to suffer because of it. Okay? So it's good to keep both of those perspectives in mind. Also around this time, you have various different Europeans who were involved in various different forms of trade, but not just trades for like goods and services or anything else like that. You have many Europeans who were involved in the trade of human beings. The Dutch were the first Europeans to introduce an idea of going into tribal stricken parts of Africa and maybe purchasing the rights to tribal prisoners from other African tribes. See, Africa around this time, before large-scale European colonization of the continent, was comprised of many various different African tribal ethnic groups that were oftentimes very much at odds and conflict. Imagine that. People in conflict with each other. Never happens in world history. Native Americans, never in conflict with each other, right? No. It's human nature, okay? You have Africans who are at war with other Africans. And oftentimes, as a result of the spoils of war, you're going to create prisoners. Well, Europeans around this time had this idea of, we have this inflated form of self that believes that these Africans are physically rock solid, but maybe they're lacking mental faculties. Okay? And they recognized there could be an entire movement to where you have African tribes people who hate their rivals so much that they would be willing to sell that person to me. I could exchange these rifles and say, hey, African tribesmen, I'll give you this modern weapon over here, which will give you a further advantage over your rival if you give this person, human being, to me. Okay. What you're also going to see is the idea that all these crops being grown in the Americas can now be mass produced, and you have various different climates that are ideally suited for just that. Europeans develop a taste for sugar. Okay? Eventually they'll also develop a taste for tobacco. So when you're growing crops, you need labor. Well, you have a ready-made human trafficking source all the way from West Africa, and you have people who are very willing to sell their rival to these pasty people. Okay? What you're beginning to see is a slave trade. The Dutch were the first Europeans to introduce it, and it would be expanded by other Europeans. But it was the Dutch who started it. You have African tribesmen who were eager to benefit from it. You have an agricultural output where it's necessary to have laborious activity. You need human capital. Okay? So the idea of the slave trade starting comes from this time. It gets far worse. But it starts somewhere, and it starts during this time as the Columbian Exchange begins to happen. So you start to exchange peoples. Okay? And that's another unfortunate consequence of this era, is that now you've started a slave trade that's based on labor. And there were people that were too eager to try and get rid of their rivals, and you had people that wanted to exploit that. Okay? Today, we know how awful that is. And in 2020, there are other forms of slavery, just different, and they're in the shadows. Nowadays, you have human sex trafficking and whatnot, and it's estimated that in the DFW area, there are over 100,000 victims of the sex trade. That's modern day slavery. And it's often done in the shadows, and you hear various different stories about people in parking lots and having children being targeted and all kinds of different things. The thought is sickening. Okay? It's a very unfortunate aspect of human history altogether. Eventually, we're going to talk about how it's specific to the United States, but what you see is a worldwide issue of human trade. And it had to start somewhere, and we can thank the Dutch for it.